My name is Jamila Hamami. I'm a member of the Open Borders Conference Steering Committee. I'm also the MC for the conference this year. So thank you all for attending. We're very excited for our next panel, which is Climate Change, COVID-19, and Border Abolition. I'm going to pass it over to our incredible movement journalist moderator, Janet Burns. And from there, Janet will introduce everyone else. So thank you so much for attending, and we look forward to this talk.
Thank you so much, Jamila. I'm gonna apologize in advance if my cat makes a lot of noise, trying to manage that. Yeah, as Jamila mentioned, Janet, based here in New York, and I'm so excited to be moderating a panel and being part of this conference with so many incredible thinkers and researchers and whatnot. So I'll move along to the introductions. This panel today includes Khury Petersen-Smith, who is the Michael Ratner Middle East Fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies, where he researches the war on terror, Israeli apartheid, the Palestinian freedom struggle, and the militarization of borders. Victoria Reyes is an assistant professor in the Department of Gender and Sexuality Studies at the University of California, Riverside. She studies culture, borders, and empire, and is author of the award-winning book, Global Borderlands, Fantasy, Violence, and Empire in Subic Bay, Philippines, which was published in 2019 by Stanford University Press. Also joined by Tina Shull, who's a public historian of race, empire, immigration enforcement, and climate migration in the modern US and the world. She holds a PhD in history from UC Irvine, a master's in humanities and social thought from NYU, and a BA in Harvard from UCLA. Her forthcoming book from UNC Press, Detention Empire, explores the rise of migrant detention in the 1980s as a form of counterinsurgency. Shull is also the creator of the digital archives IMM Print and Climate Refugee Stories, something we'll touch on today. She was awarded a Soros Justice Fellowship from the Open Society Foundations for her work in immigration detention storytelling, among other accolades and recognitions. And last but not least, John Washington writes about immigration and border politics, as well as criminal justice and literature. His first book, The Dispossessed, A Story of Asylum at the US-Mexico Border and Beyond, was published in 2020 by Verso Books. Washington is also a translator, having co-translated most recently The Hollywood Kid by Oscar Martinez and Juan Martinez, and Blood Barrios by Alberto Ari, which won a PEN Translates Award. So our panel has some pretty big topics. We've been talking in the past few weeks about how to best address these, and can't touch on every aspect of how COVID and climate are affecting the world and the world of borders today, but we're certainly going to do our best. We're going to dive in first with a number of broad questions, and we're going to engage various panelists on this before getting into specialist areas. The first one, we've got Tina, and then Khury will be on deck after that. Thanks, Tina, for taking this. So people often use a crisis, such as the pandemic or climate change, we're both experiencing now, as a way to justify migration restrictions. Can you talk about how this habit has played out historically?
Thank you, Janet. Hi, everyone. I'm speaking from unceded territory of the Catawba, Cherokee, Shuguri, and Waxhaw people in North Carolina. I'm really honored to be here, and I want to thank Jamila, the OBC conference organizers, and Free Migration Project. Thank you, Janet, for moderating. Thanks to the amazing translators and other panelists, and everyone for being here today for this critical conversation. I think it's very fitting that this panel is made up of people who specialize in empire, militarism, and border imperialism, because that's what addressing climate change and COVID really requires. As Harsha Walia says, we cannot separate borders from histories of settler colonialism, slavery, and racial capitalism, which are also the origins of the climate crisis. From the standpoint of US empire, which includes foreign policy, militarism, consumer capitalism, and yes, humanitarianism, which all depend on ecocide and global apartheid. COVID-19 and now climate change have become new excuses to address the quote unquote crisis of migration. I want to start by mentioning a report that the White House issued a few weeks ago on the impact of climate change on migration. It says it's the first time that the US government is officially reporting on the link between climate and migration, even though, as author Todd Miller points out, the Pentagon has long been drawing up plans for impending climate migration crisis. Biden's report, written by DHS, the Department of Defense, and the National Security Council, which is very telling, predicts heightened global conflict, insecurity, and climate-induced mass migration. The report says that its purpose is to direct flows of US foreign assistance to nations, quote, so that migrations may be planned or in some cases avoided altogether, unquote. The day after, the New York Times warned climate change poses a widening threat to national security. I counter that climate change poses a threat to nationalism and to borders, and that's not a bad thing. Indigenous and migrant groups who've been targeted and displaced by the ecocide of US empire know that the US has long weaponized the environment in the name of national security, especially in the US-Mexico borderlands, which extend to the Caribbean and Central America and abroad. Today's responses to migration as a crisis are variations on this same historical theme. This rhetoric is reminiscent of past US government articulations of migration crisis, framed by the Cold War, the war on drugs, war on terror, and past global epidemics such as HIV and AIDS, which have also targeted the Caribbean and Central American region, showing how border politics have been anti-Black and anti-Indigenous at the core. The US has historically responded with border militarism, but also with strategies of, quote, trade and aid, especially since the 1980s, that went hand in hand with the rise of neoliberal economics and global capitalism. In my work, I go back to the 80s because in many ways they were a critical turning point when the character of US empire transformed through proxy wars and new forms of economic coercion that appeared to make US power less visible and more benevolent, but no less violent. These trends have grave implications for the rise of mass incarceration, borders, and for fueling climate change. Both COVID and climate change are rendering people simultaneously more mobile and more stuck in place than ever before. They are accelerating inequality in new ways and laying bare the violent ends of borders and bordering practices, which is death. This is seen especially in detention spaces. I would say Biden's report calling for US aid to control and restrict migration, even if couched in humanitarian terms, is a continuation of imperialism by other means, and it will result in the same outcomes. Border abolition is the only solution.
Thank you. Yeah, if Khury is available, hand him down. Okay, excellent. Have follow up on that, please. No. But yeah, just to restate the question, yeah, just any historical look at how this kind of justification has played out, migration restrictions because of this or that crisis. Tina did a great job of getting us warmed up.
Yeah, absolutely. She did. First of all, gratitude to you, Janet, and all the organizers of this really timely and important conference. And I'm really grateful to be here with my fellow panelists. And I'm very happy to follow up on what Tina said, since it was absolutely so insightful, and I'm in full agreement. So I'll just to contribute, I think that the one thing I want kind of taken away is that the border is kind of, these crises end up being a context to really assert and define and recast the border. But what happens after a crisis, which is by its nature temporary, is a lasting effect on the people targeted by the violence that's enacted in the crisis, and actually a lasting effect on the border regime itself. So, historically, public health has been used as part of the justification for a regulatory regime at the border. People may be familiar with the kind of, in the lore of American immigration, the stories of people coming to Ellis Island, and less conversation about Angel Island on the West Coast. But part of that was this notion of screening for public health, which was justified in the context of various public health crises. And just to say, that has been part of the kind of the notion that public health is tied to the border itself and the border processes of screening who comes in and out, has been part of not only structurally shaping the border, but also ideologically framing migrants as sort of inherently a threat to public health, which of course is a lasting myth, a lasting racist myth. I think about the Bracero program, which was used in the 20th century to facilitate labor migration of workers from Mexico, and how public health was a context that was deployed to control that migration as well. I have a friend and comrade whose father or whose grandfather was part of the Bracero program. It was subject to all kinds of measures in the name of public health, including being sprayed with chemicals and things like that, which again have a lasting impact, ironically, on the health of the people who are subject to that violence, I would say. But also this notion that there is something inherently dangerous or threatening about, American US public health from Mexican people. So that's one thing. The second kind of context I want to talk about, and Tina spoke to it, is war as one kind of category of crisis that has been used to shape the border, again, in ways that are lasting. There are really many examples of this, but I'll just highlight a couple. One is during World War II, which had, as the US waged a war abroad, that had profound implications for what was happening domestically, and the targeting of Japanese and Japanese American folks in particular, which was key in terms of empowering the US border regime to target certain people, mass internment in concentration camps, and so on, in ways that, again, have had, of course, an impact on the people who were interned and their descendants, but also an impact on the whole US border regime in a way that I think was revived in a very, horrific way under Trump, actually. When Trump first came into office and was talking about things like justifying the Muslim ban, Trump administration officials said, well, we have a precedent for this in US history when we interned the Japanese during World War II. And the last point is the current set of wars that we kind of inhabit, the era of the war on terror. And of course, the 9/11 attacks were used to justify not only tremendous violence abroad, but of course, a whole set of violences domestically in terms of surveillance, detentions, and deportations. But really the recasting, like a massive moment in the transformation of the US border in particular. We know that the border has been a violent white supremacist institution since well before 9/11. But to remind ourselves that the Department of Homeland Security did not exist prior to the war on terror. That was a massive kind of moment in the history of the iteration of the US border. Alfonso Gonzalez, in this fantastic book, Reform Without Justice, talks about, the many decades of migration from Latin America into North America, but how under the Homeland Security regime, there was a new kind of both ideological and structural barriers that folks faced when migrating. So those are a couple of examples that are unfortunately enduring and well after a crisis. And as Tina said, it really points to the problem of the border itself and the need to abolish it.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, just because we've got a packed day, I'll keep moving. There's a lot I'm thinking about from what you said, and we'll save some of these for the end of our talk. But call it John next, just to help us narrow in this conversation. There we go. Okay. Yeah, just to quickly follow up on what Khury and Tina were talking about, could you help us look at the last couple years specifically and how these sort of crisis justifications have played out? I love the phrase that Khury used, the current set of wars that we inhabit. So, feel free to take whatever direction you.
Yeah, echoing the thanks and appreciation the first two panelists started with, but I'll just try to jump right in. And I completely agree with Khury. I also like your framing of just like this cumulative and lasting and enduring, I mean, as disturbing as they are, effects. And that's something I think is really important to keep in mind during the current administration, because even as we move at least towards this rhetoric of a softer approach towards immigration and towards our response to border crossers, what's really important to remember is that the advances in anti-immigration excuse me, and border imperialist regime, the leaps and advances taken during the Trump administration are still there. It's not like we start from somewhere like closer to zero. It's that the Biden administration, everything that the Biden administration does as it moved towards this so-called smart border, or smarter border, really big scare quotes around that word smart, is building on the infrastructure and the practices already in place. And so, I spent some time in the past week or so. I'm currently based in Arizona. I'm not there now, but along the US-Mexico border and seeing the incredible construction that's happened there, construction and destruction that has happened there over the time. And so when Biden administration is saying, well, we're not going to build another foot of border wall, it's like, but there's hundreds of miles of border wall in place. That's not going away. So to build on top of that, this smarter, supposedly smarter border is really alarming. I mean, it is absolutely becoming more and more this zone of absolute operational control, which is the ultimate end goal. And it's really disturbing. So currently also what the Biden administration wants to build off of, there are, the numbers anyone can look up, but there are around 400 fixed integrated towers. There are hundreds of mobile surveillance units dragged around by Border Patrol trucks. There are license plate readers. They now have technology that they use and is publicly used to hack into cars' systems to look at the infotainment systems, mobile license plate readers, facial recognition technology. All of that is just being completely swiped across the border, and it's becoming this zone of absolute surveillance, which is incredibly alarming, not just for all the implications of the violation to your personal space and citizen or non-citizen, of course, and the taking of all of your personal information, but we know that the current, the traditional border crossers are as deterred and pushed into the remote regions of the desert by smart technology as by medieval wall technology. There's a paper by Sam Chambers, who may be chiming in, who I was just reading the other day about. He just studied very carefully where the mobile surveillance or the permanent surveillance units are set, and in a very similar way, because they're visible and because people know that they're there, move around them into the more dangerous areas of the desert because they're there, and it is as deadly as just the actual border technology. So this is like the crisis that is being built off of all of these, like this stack of former crises. And there's, I think there's been, like Khury was setting some really important historical examples, as well as Tina from the 80s. And, one other I'd like to add, I think is relevant to our times of COVID in particular, is the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924, which put in the immigration quota system that was based on the 1890 census. People probably know a little bit of that history. Sometimes folks forget that it was based off of the Emergency Quota Act of 1921, which was in direct response, in part, as well as to a number, of things, the post-war slight depression, was in response to the epidemic of the pandemic of 1918. And so right now what we're seeing is, the perpetuation of the use of Title 42 in other ways to permanently, basically, or automatically exclude border crossers, even asylum seekers. And of course, it's become basically permanent at this point. It's, a year and a half that this has been invoked, and there's no real clear talks of canceling it. Clearly, there's no health effect, positive, at least positive. Like, there's very likely, and I guess there is a negative health effect. There's like this way that they just use what's in place, and just kind of springboard to this ever increasing control. And very last comment is this cumulative effect, I think, is really scary to hear about, but I'd like to kind of end my quick comments on a positive note. I think the movements towards abolition, the movements towards, undoing border imperialism also is cumulative to a degree. We also build off of past achievements, and we also do gain momentum. And I think we are gaining momentum. This conference, maybe, success in its third or fourth year, I think is one like small example, but I think we do really also gain momentum and learn from, our past generations, from the abolitionist movement to the sanctuary movement to, to early 2000s to, abolish ICE and beyond. So not all completely bleak. Thanks.
Thank you for that. And that's an excellent idea and inclination to give people a bit of promise. And yeah, I very much agree. In this conference and around the world, it is very heartening to me to see so much momentum and energy around these issues, often because of the negative effects that we have witnessed and are witnessing. And don't go too far away, John. I'm going to send one back to you real quick. As a few people have mentioned, borders are not just walls, they're not just rivers. This has been true, but has become a lot more complicated in the past few years, and something that I think about a lot, covering as a movement reporter and covering tech and privacy is, as we come and go, how we're being tracked as well as assessed. And as I'm sure most folks attending this conference today are aware, people that so-called undocumentedly enter the US or don't do it via the approved methods of whatever authority is in charge at that time are typically not crossing a physical border. They're often arriving in an airport and passing through customs, or crossing a border on a train. So the border itself is very flexible in that one way, and not a lot of other very human ways. But it's extended into a whole network. We have virtual borders. There are overlapping federal and state borders. So if John is around, I just wanted to ask one quick question. Could you give us a sense of the expectations and standards around vaccination, screening, things like that right now? Because I was personally a little confused and definitely concerned when I saw President Biden's, I don't know why I gave him that honorific, but his executive order the other week, and we were talking about this ahead of time in prep. It's not clear to me what the standards are. There's some, there is a bar set where people from countries with lower vaccination rates are going to be allowed in, but there's this sort of loose expectation that they will become vaccinated at a point, or there's certain medicines, certain vaccinations that the US accepts and some that it doesn't. Could you help us make a little sense of that?
I can try, but I think it's actually a little complicated. And so, we don't have complete clarity on who's in and who's allowed in. I mean, the important thing to remember, and I mentioned Title 42 like a few minutes ago, and that is a CDC issued health guideline based on a 1942 law, I think, or something around there, that gives executive authority to stop people from coming in when there's a public health crisis, which medically, scientifically makes zero sense. For the entire, since the institution of Title 42 in spring of 2020, there continued to be, except for sometimes when the border was more closed, there continued to be tens of millions of people that crossed the border almost on a weekly basis. I'm talking about the US-Mexico border, but the Title 42 was designed to only really target asylum seekers. So, it is so absolutely transparent what such a tool is being used for, that there is actually no public health reason to have it. And as for vaccinations and the rollout of who's required to show what and who's actually given the vaccination or given access to the vaccination is a huge question still. I mean, look at ICE detention centers or even Border Patrol holding facilities. There's people like the governor of Texas call out this idea that people crossing the border are a public threat, when people with visas are crossing the border all the time. The border with Mexico and Texas are crossing the border all the time, but he only, references there people who don't have papers. And then also is willing to round up folks, Abbott and the Biden administration are willing to round up folks, put them in unsanitary detention centers that are where it's impossible to socially distance, where they're not given access to standard PPE, and while they're being potentially infected by people who are in and out and are unvaccinated. So there is no actual rhyme or reason except for the exclusion of undocumented people for any of these public health things. So I mean, the particulars of it, I actually don't know, and I think we don't know. That it's confidence coming out. But I think that is just like the important framing to really take away.
Yeah, no, I think that's really well put. And given the importance of so many things going on, yeah, we don't need to. No one needs to waste their time sorting for reason when reason does not exist. Yeah, no, it is very much part of a bigger issue. Yeah, we'll hit one more general question before we'll dig into some specific questions for the panelists. But just to wrap some of these things up, Khury, we've been talking about how borders are used to define not only where a person lives or what their status is, but very aspects of health and is it wellness, illness, disease. So I want to circle back to Harsha Walia, who you got to speak with, I guess it's now last month, for a really fascinating discussion. And she discusses borders as defining the boundaries between some of these, very momentous and often sort of mishandled states of human existence. Is there anything you'd like to weigh on how borders are affecting our definitions right now of, disease, infection, boundaries of human rights and existence?
Sure. Yeah. Shout out to Harsha Walia. Everybody check out her work. And I mean, there's to say about this. I appreciate, Janet, the very expansive notion of the border that you put on the table, that it's not just a physical location, but a regime that certainly, if you've been to a physical national border, you see this incredibly violent entity, or when you go to an international airport and you clear the border and you see the kind of ways that people are directed, where it says US citizens this way, everybody else this way, and you see the kind of stratification of people. You see how long the varying lines are, and who has access and who doesn't, what kind of access. All of these are characteristic of the border, as a location, but it's so much more than that. It's a whole regime. Of course, there's this extensive surveillance regime that involves various police forces, that involves surveillance technology, that for people of the different, who are assigned different statuses of permission to be within a country, in this country, for example, the United States, there are ankle monitors and all kinds of ways that the border is present. So just on that point, I want to say I'm reminded of the geographer Allison Mounts talks about the border as haunting, that it kind of can follow people like a ghost based on their legal, their status and their legal permissions to be in or not in a nation state. But to your question about defining boundaries, as I pointed out earlier, yes, the question of public health has been mobilized in different ways, in ways that are not only connected to the border, but very much racialized. And just by way of illustrating that point again, we'll point to the example that I think you put on the table and John spoke to as well. When we think about like the state of Texas, where the governor simultaneously is saying, we need more militarization of the border to prevent migrants from coming because they threaten our public health, and at the same exact time making illegal mask mandates and vaccine mandates, like actual measures to address the public health of people, in the state that he is charged with governing. The last point is just that the definition of these boundaries that come with bordering, which is a term that Harsha uses a lot that I really appreciate, border as verb, it's an action, that is a national project and a racial project. The notion of who is allowed to come into the US is tied to the question, for example, but this is true in the various nation states around the world, is tied to who is allowed to be an American. And then what does it mean to be a real American? And we know that that is a racial question. The question of the Border Patrol itself as an agency, the roots of that agency are in white supremacist vigilante gangs in Texas that were actually patrolling the border, not only to control the movement of folks on the Mexican side, but actually to control the movement of enslaved Black people in Texas. So this is a white supremacist project. That is the foundation, of the Border Patrol, and the border, both as a physical location and the border writ large, is the site for the production of white supremacy. So we have to talk about that when we're talking about the question of boundaries and who's in and who's out.
Yeah, lots of great points. I also have found bordering as a verb to be really useful in helping think about so many of these issues, and I'm passing it along. I skipped a question, so I'm going to hop back to that real quickly. We've not yet heard from Victoria Reyes, who's been very patient. So thank you again for being patient with the technical issues. So yeah, I'm going to leave it pretty open, and we've talked about your expertise is also broad. So yeah, Victoria, how are borders and border politics different today, in your view, in the context, say, of climate change and COVID than in the past?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks to you, Janet, for moderating this, to Tina, Khury, and John as fellow panelists, Jamila for their work, and the rest of the organizers. I mean, I think similar to what my fellow panelists have said, it's to understand that borders and border politics are rooted in power and empire, which are racialized, gendered, classed, historically and contemporarily, right? So thinking about, even I am speaking on, I'm working on the unceded lands of the Cahuilla, the Tongva, Luisaño, and Serrano people, and all their ancestors, descendants, past, present, and future, who are caretakers of the land, air, and water. And I say that to kind of not purely as symbolic, but really to root our presence that we are currently complicit in empire, right? We are currently part of the dispossession of people. And so I really think that in this age of COVID and climate change, it is intensified, but I also think that historically it's also been fraught. And who crosses which borders, how borders are defined, has been the purview of empire. So as Khury mentioned, public health has been used to justify empire and border creations, both, as Khury mentioned, kind of coming into the US, but also the expansion of the US, right? The US as including the Philippines as part of its border, right, of the US presence in its Pacific island or empire, right? That is to say, US has used its territory of the Philippines when it was a colony as justification that it is a Pacific power, and its justification in that space. But we also see that the border to include is not inclusive, right? That it's used to exclude, perpetuate. It is not given free rights. We see that contemporarily with Guam, Puerto Rico, kind of territories of the United States who aren't given kind of the same rights as states and are kind of occupy this colonial position today. And so the US has justified and used public health, for example, to conquer the Philippines, to see Filipinos as diseased and used as justification to implement hygiene and mold Filipinos into what they saw as kind of quote unquote fit and healthy, ready to lead, and in their policy of so-called benevolent assimilation, while at the same time violently killing Filipinos who already had a self-run government that was ready to take over after kind of Spanish colonialism was thrown off. I mean, I think you also see today the phenomenon of Filipino nurses, and that is not a coincidence, right? Kathy Choi has this great book, Empire of Care, and she documents how US empire is precisely that reason we see this pathway, not only through an Americanized nursing curriculum, these efforts to kind of unify the Philippines, quote unquote, under English as a language, but also how US hospitals turn to the Philippines to actively recruit. And today, 1/5 of total nurses in California are Filipino. They account for 4% of registered nurses worldwide, but they account for nearly 1/3 of registered nurses who have died of COVID-19, right? Filipino nurses are more likely than white nurses to work in wings, like intensive care units, emergency rooms, and they increase their exposures to patients with severe COVID-19 symptoms. And so thinking about how all of this relates to one another, and there is not quite this distinction.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I really appreciate those points. And so that's something I've been thinking about as well. The disparities in the actual healthcare community in the US, if it's fair to call it a community. And yeah, how the work and the illness and the pay, among other things, yeah, really don't distribute equally. And so often are justified in their differences by someone's nation of origin. If you're still available, Victoria, I'd like to bounce this back to you briefly. Hooray, thank you. Something that you mentioned about, forced unification of different, cultures and island nations within what we think of as the Philippines and in Pacific Rim and Oceania. That's something I've been thinking about a lot as well right now, as climate change is very imminently very tangibly threatening people, so many of these cultures that have historically been imperialized and dominated by folks wandering around on, say, both sides of this continent and beyond. What are those, if you're able to offer a sense, I'm wondering what some of those borders look like sort of on the ground in the places where they're being, in a sense, projected from other parts of the world. Are you finding that there is a disparity in parts of the Philippines between the kinds of access that people are having to healthcare or to even just, information about it? I'm curious how the U.S. Drawing on the Philippines so heavily, and particularly on Filipino women, looks like for communities on the ground. Is that something you could speak to at all?
Yeah, I mean, I can just say even my family who, I send remittances home to, don't have access to a vaccine yet. We still don't have, in the US, people are getting booster shots, and worldwide, just the first vaccine shot or even the second dose is not widely available, right? And so we can actually see how vaccines and COVID-19 actually intersect with militarization. So President Duterte actually threatened to withdraw from this longstanding military agreement, the Visiting Forces Agreement with the United States. And, part of this, I think, and many others think that it was a tool of negotiation, and it was, but he also used it as this leverage and in negotiations with the US to get more vaccines, right? That he was able to say, I will sign this and I will not withdraw, but I get more vaccines and millions of vaccines for kind of the Philippines. So the US has been kind of a gatekeeper. And what we find is, and I just want to speak for a minute or two so my other panelists can get in, is that what has happened, COVID-19 has fundamentally shifted, as in the US and elsewhere, kind of politics. So for example, with a co-editor of mine for a special issue of Context, which Fabio Rojas actually co-edits that peer-reviewed magazine, and I co-edited a special issue. My co-editor and I, Marco Garrido, interviewed Filipino journalist Maria Ressa before she won the Nobel Peace Prize about the war on drugs and COVID's impact in particular. And so we see that, Duterte ran on a platform of cleaning up and addressing the drug war and really kind of lead by violence. And so what we discussed with Maria Ressa is how COVID has allowed Duterte to consolidate his power without the need to officially declare martial law, because COVID kind of created these conditions for martial law, and that you have people kind of Duterte responding with arrests, and the war on drug has resulted in thousands of unjustified killings and murders of people, both by the police and extrajudicial. And so what has happened is that it allows this consolidation of power in the Philippines. People who are at home and using social media, this hashtag oust Duterte. But what happens is then people get arrested, right? People are arrested for these things.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you for helping pull that together. For me, the Philippines comes to mind in the examples that you're talking about when I think about how there are sort of borders of the mind, how these differentiations and these often very cruel boundaries that we're creating are not just perpetuated through walls, but through culture so much. And the drug war, which we will dig into a bit more as time allows, is a topic of interest to me. I remember seeing an app that was about killing zombies in a particular neighborhood on one of the Philippine main islands that was coming out in the context of the drug war, and perpetuating in our neighborhoods, but around the world, sort of these boundaries which are being so conscientiously set, is it whether someone has been exposed or infected by or is ill with something, how we view that, or whether they have a substance use problem or are an addict that is a danger. I feel like these definitions keep coming up. We are going to keep moving. So we got such a packed panel. All right. Khury, you're next. I think that Victoria did a wonderful job of bringing us up to the topic of militarization as part of the imperial machine. And so I'd like to hop to another part of the globe. Khury, would you weigh in on how imperialism and militarization in the Middle East has prevented free movement there, and any ecological impacts that you'd like to weigh in on in the Middle East as well?
Sure, and of course, we could talk for years about that. Literally, just a few things to point out. So, I mean, the process of bordering around the world is this process that is, it is kind of essentially linked to the question of colonization. That's true in this place, as my other panelists have pointed out, that the bordering of these lands involve the dispossession of indigenous peoples here and kind of ongoing violence against indigenous, nations and groups of people. And, I know that we're all in solidarity with the ongoing resistance. But that is true all around the world. And in the Middle East, folks may be familiar with the fact that after World War I, British and French imperialists sat down and drew lines on the map of West Asia and decided which places France gets and which places Britain gets. And, therein lie the origins of the kind of modern, national boundaries of that region. It was straight up colonization through the violence of war and the violence of colonialism. So, there's the origin of the boundaries themselves. And I just think about the many, many iterations of violence that involved. I think about, for example, indigenous Bedouin communities that many of which were nomadic and who migrated across spaces, as migration has been part of human existence literally for the duration of humanity. And nomadic peoples were resettled and told, oh, actually you live here now, you are you're Emirati, you're Qatari, you're a citizen of Saudi Arabia, and so on. And this is an incredibly violent process. So again, we could talk endlessly about that. When we talk about the ongoing Israeli colonization of Palestinian land, I think that's extremely important in any conversation about bordering for so many reasons. But one is just that I think that the Israeli state has done a great service to the states of the world. And I think that Israel is quite self-conscious of its role as really an incubator of different technologies and ideologies of the control of movement of people. There are so many things that the state of Israel has kind of advanced or piloted that at certain points were considered beyond the pale of what's acceptable politically in the so-called international community. I'm thinking, for example, of the construction of the apartheid wall across the West Bank. As John pointed out, there were border walls before that, but Israel in a very high profile way said that we are going to construct a physical barrier to keep Palestinians on this side. At the time it was done, it was condemned. It was in the early 2000s. It was said, this is unacceptable. There were legal cases against it, and Israel went forward with it. And it ended up legitimizing the notion that a state could build a wall, a physical barrier. And that is something that has been taken up around the world since, across Europe, certainly, especially after 2015, but actually in the Middle East right now, there's any number of physical barriers being built. Oman is building a barrier against Yemen. Saudi Arabia is also building one against Yemen. Jordan against to control the movement of Iraqis and Syrians, and so on. All of which, by the way, receive funding from the United States. So this region has been, unfortunately, a site of the experimentation in bordering and in the control of movement of people, and Palestinian people in particular. So many states around the world are saying, we don't want refugees. And Israel says, we know how to control refugees. We'll sell you our technology. And that technology exists on the US-Mexico border. What's crucial, what I'll end this point on, is the fact that that is fiercely contested by people throughout the region, but especially Palestinians resisting those kinds of controls. And I think that, at the same time as we learn from what Israel has done in terms of developing bordering technologies, we should also learn from Palestinian resistance in terms of defending the right of the freedom of movement.
Absolutely. And, if a few folks have mentioned efforts that, can be inspiring to us right now, or, can be a bit encouraging towards the future, but also through hardship can teach us so much. And that's definitely the case in Palestine. Hopping back over to Tina, so we're talking about efforts to oppose these kinds of oppressive, imperialist, and bordering strategies. We see pushback to that opposition. This is something that you have focused on a fair bit. You've also particularly written a great deal on detention in the 1980s, which is a kind of heyday for a lot of the topics that we're touching on. Can you tell us in lay terms what you mean by the idea of detention as a form of counterinsurgency?
Absolutely. I argue that detention trends reflect and expose the climate and COVID crises as they concentrate and work to absolve the violence of US power that we've been discussing. Counterinsurgency is a US strategy of warfare and policing that is retaliatory against those deemed enemies of the state. It is self-admittedly a form of terrorism that aims to be less visible, and it has psychosocial components. It's offensive, no doubt, but it positions itself as defensive, and it positions the state as a victim of insurgent or revolutionary movements that you just mentioned. This was really apparent in the Reagan administration's globalized war on drugs and new kinds of restrictions, such as Haitian interdiction and militarized and contract detention, aiming to contain combined threats of Black, Afro-Latinx, and Indigenous migrations, communism or leftist politics and anti-imperial revolution, and also HIV, AIDS, and alleged narco trafficking. And so arriving migrants who are literally testimony of the violence of US imperialism are deemed enemies of the state and subject to targeting, surveillance, and criminalization. And there's an important rhetorical component to this. For Reagan, tactics of denial, gaslighting, and straight up disinformation campaigns were central to US proxy wars and migration control. And this extends to climate change through climate denialism and the rise of eco-fascism, which is an ideology rooted in white supremacy that demands militarized responses to the climate crisis. This can be seen in militarized policing and criminalization, disappearances of environmental protectors, from Berta Cáceres to Standing Rock to No More Deaths. Counterinsurgency can be understood as literally the application of bordering practices on those who seek to preserve and protect life. And the end result of that is death. As this is evidenced in detention, which are microcosms and sites that absolve, they serve to absolve the violence of US power. And detention is also a locus of climate crisis on many fronts. First, in the climate origins of migration, in the ways that Indigenous and environmental protectors are persecuted and displaced. and also the ways in which prisons, military bases, and detention sites are sites of environmental racism and toxicity themselves, such as during the pandemic, we saw at the Adelanto prison in California, migrants being exposed to high levels of a toxic chemical called HDQ neutral. And this is still happening today under Biden. And in the overlapping ways in which communities impacted and displaced by climate gentrification and movements are subject to environmental racism and are often people of color and recently arriving migrants. So these are some of the stories that are documented and shared in the Climate Refugee Stories Project. And I'll end there, but I'll plug the afternoon panel. And panelist Tanaya Dattagupta, who is our team member, may also speak about this project in the context of Bangladesh.
Thank you so much for tying so many of the things together. And an excellent plug. All right, we are going to start taking questions shortly. I think just a couple, if any, come in. But I'd like to see if John would be willing to give us maybe 30 or 60 seconds on something, and also maybe get Victoria in there. Yeah, last question that we had down. As you mentioned, you've been spending time on the US-Mexico borderlands in Arizona. You told us about, some of the alarming aspects that are happening in terms of political, social, privacy implications. But can you give us, to tie into what Tina was saying, a sense of the environmental impacts? Because I know your work has taken you through parts of North and Central America and Northern and South America, where climate and drug war just, hitting one after the other. They're both driving. So yeah, what's the scene like where you have been?
Yeah, I'd like to tie in as close as I can to Tina's comments about a scene that I have been witnessing just in the last couple of days. I'm covering the trial of Amber Ortega, who is an indigenous Hayachet Otham, member of the Hayachet Otham Nation. And on Thursday was her hearing for trespassing, which she allegedly did September of 2020, right along the current boundary of the United States and Mexico. And she was so-called trespassing on ancient ancestral land. She went to a rare spring, a desert spring, to pray, heard this heavy machinery, and she and another member of the nation went and to try to protest and try to block the border wall construction, which was, to construct that border wall. There's so much to say here. I'll try to mention it quickly and tie this back around to some counterinsurgency points that Tina was making. To construct the wall, it's not just to put up an actual wall. Of course, I was talking before about the surveillance aspect and this almost like backseat also walling and bordering that happens. But to construct the actual infrastructure of the wall, they need to, it's a monumental effort in which they need to build roads, they need to, actually blast through and dynamite through mountains. They need to, in order to put the cement footers in and to fill these bollard pylons with cement, they need to drill up lots of water. And in just a single well location along the US-Mexico border, while they're undergoing construction, they were sucking out about 700,000 gallons per day. 700,000 gallons of water from desert aquifers per day. And they were doing that on indigenous land or unrecognized indigenous land. And this woman, Amber Ortega, was protesting. She was arrested for trespassing, and where she was actually taken to, interestingly, she is also a US citizen and a member of the Hayachet Otham Nation. She was taken to, after her arrest, to an immigration detention center, which makes no sense when you look at it from a sane perspective, but it makes perfect sense when you think of it as within the context of this greater counterinsurgency effort of border militarism. Like, of course, it was both Border Patrol and Park Services who have historically dispossessed lots of native nations from their land. They work hand in glove. also with the border industrial complex. She was taken to a private detention center, a privately run detention center. And what is both surprising and not is the arrest happened under the Trump administration. No surprise there, of course, but the Biden administration is pursuing charges. She is in federal court and they are aggressively pursuing charges, trying to dismiss her claim under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And they said, I was at the trial on Thursday, and the government prosecutor said multiple times, this is government land. This is a quote, we can do whatever we want. And they do. And what they're doing is, and I'll try to end here and tie it back into the idea about ecocide and climate crisis. What they're doing is have complete disregard, impudent disregard for the environment, and they're absolutely destroying it. And Amber Ortega's defense, one of her defenses, was that these things aren't separate. Like, it is sacred land because it is land that we care for and land that is ecologically sound. And it is something that can thrive in the desert as it is. And there's this respect for the land that is part of the drive towards abolitionism. I think that respect for the land and people on the land is something that, like, this profound and deep respect is a way to counter the counterinsurgency, is a way to counter like the border industrial complex and border militarism. So yeah, sharing some thoughts from that recent really disturbing trial.
Yeah, no kidding. Thank you so much for that update. I've been following in the news a bit, but yeah, no, some of those details are pretty staggering. And I guess it speaks to the privileged upbringing that I have had, that I am still surprised. I experienced a form of surprise when judges mouth off like that, when they say things that indicate that they're not being held accountable, but would like to be. All right, before folks break for lunch, I'm just gonna take one question that we got from our Q&A, and thank you so much everyone for listening so patiently and for sending in such engaging questions and comments. I'd like to start with Victoria, and we'll just keep it moving through the group. The comment was that they really appreciated Victoria's point that we are complicit in empire here in the US, given the ongoing genocide and dispossession of Indigenous people. So the question is, how do we bring this complicity to bear while advocating for open borders on stolen land? Thanks, Victoria. Yeah, feel free to hop in. Thank you.
30 seconds, hopefully. Well, one is, I think, advocating for and always bringing up Indigenous rights and Indigenous sovereignty as part of the question, and making that part of the issue, and having Indigenous people come and be speakers and do all of that. And also to note that part of the land back movement in terms of granting Native peoples land back is about reparations, is about them having the sovereignty. So I don't quite see these as incredibly dichotomous, right? And that it's about respecting land, it's about respecting people. But I'd like to hear more from my panelists, other fellow panelists.
I could chime in just also really quickly to go back to that same case. Yeah, that dichotomy is actually, I think, both pernicious and false, and something that was talking about the case of Amber Ortega, her previous co-defendant who got sort of pressured into taking a plea deal earlier this year. What she told me just the other day when I was interviewing her was that what she it so galls her is when she's on a conference, she's talking about Indigenous rights, and then on that conference, to kind of round out the topics, there's someone who talks about environmental rights, and but they're the same thing. She was saying, they're of course they're the same thing, and I think that what I was trying to kind of explain at the end of the previous comment was, yeah, they're just we need to blend these things, and we can't think about them as separate. And so yeah, just completely agree, Victoria.
Thank you. I definitely agree with Victoria and John and Khury's comments earlier, and this whole discussion has been so rich. I would just add that, yes, climate change and COVID present new opportunities for movements for migrant and Indigenous rights to find common cause and be in solidarity, because they make the historical intertwined roles of settler colonialism, militarism, racial capitalism, all the isms clear to more people. When I was teaching at UC Irvine, we had a Tongva leader come speak to our students, and in a really powerful moment, an undocumented student asked her, you know, we are the ones who don't belong. We are the newest comers to this land. How do we be in solidarity? You know, and she said, we are all fighting the same forces. It is the border itself that is creating these divisions. And as John said, this false dichotomy, this false choice. And also, as Victoria said, just honoring, you know, Indigenous voices and allowing them to speak first and last and into the future.
Right on. Gratitude to all of my fellow panelists. And I'll just say, you know, that the question is about, for those of us who are not Indigenous, what are our complicities, which I think is important to reflect on, but I'm more concerned with what are our responsibilities. And I think that this is like, we are very lucky because this is like an amazing moment in the history, the like 5 centuries long history of Indigenous resistance. Like right now, what is happening at like line 3 and the land back movement and this moment for Indigenous feminism is so generously extending to those of us who want to be in solidarity precisely how we can do so. And as my co-panelists have said, analytically connecting all of it, borders, colonization, the destruction of the planet, dehumanization of various peoples, you know, the fact that they are crafting legislation, you know, criminalizing water protectors as terrorists, as part of the war on terror and the ongoing colonization of this place, they're connecting all of the dots for us. And I think that what they point to is that this project called the United States is illegitimate. It actually has no, it has no legitimacy. And I think that these struggles for Indigenous liberation, sovereignty, you know, and autonomy explode all of that. So let's honor that as part of it. It's central to this whole project of border abolition, but it's central to our survival. Like any liberatory politics really has to have this at the center.
Thank you all so much for that. Yeah, I don't want to sully such wonderful comments, but yeah, I'm grateful to, as we look at all these things that explode into one another and keep looping back, like aspects of this conversation have to have so many, so many folks to be doing this alongside. I think, you know, more minds can help handle a problem of this size. So with that, hand it back to Jamila. I think folks probably want to have some lunch. So thank you all so much for your time and for your insights.
Thank you so much. That was an incredible panel. Check out the live tweets because that happened. And I mean, there were just so many gems in that one. I can't even. So thank you all so much for being a part of this. Thank you so much, Janet, John, Khury, Tina, and absolutely Victoria. You brought an incredible insight, Victoria, that was so internationalist. And I'm so grateful for that, as well as Khury and others. But we never get to really hear about the, you know, Filipino experience. And so that was wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. So everybody, thank you again. And we're going to break for lunch and we'll be back in just a little bit. So looking forward to it and make sure you don't miss the next panel. It's going to be incredible as abolitionist alternatives to legalization. So we will catch you then. Thank you.